Subscribe and click the bell icon for the latest updates and notifications from the Indian Express.
So I would like to honestly start by your stint during the Planning Commission, which was largely, essentially the last stage of Planning Commission. And is it the case in your view now, especially with more time having elapsed, that Planning Commission overstayed its welcome as an institution? Did it sort of, since the reform starting, it lost its significance?
Many of my friends, particularly in business, thought that it was a contradiction in terms, that you're a liberalizer, you're associated with liberalization, and you will go off and become deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And I used to make the point that you guys have absolutely no idea of what the Planning Commission does, because they were chafing at all the sorts of restraints, etc., very often that the system would put on them. And they had a completely mistaken notion that the Planning Commission was devising these rules and sending them to ministry. This is not true. It wasn't even true during the days of Pandit Nehru. In fact, Milton Friedman, in his memorandum to the US government, said that everyone thinks that P.C. Mahalanobis is very influential because what he advised Pandit Nehru does. But I think he's not influential. He knows what Pandit Nehru wants to hear and just advises him to do the same thing. So this is a real issue. The Planning Commission was not an executive body. It was ultimately always an advisory body. How do you judge what it does? What it does changed quite a bit. I think the big thing we did, which was executive, sort of, was to divide up the total development expenditure into center and states. Distribution across the states was formula driven, but center and states, the Planning Commission had a significant role. And more importantly, for the center, which ministry gets what chunk of the pie for the 5-year period. That was a financing role which we played. Other than that, we did a lot of things which to my mind were all essential. You know, evaluating programs, doing a retrospective, independent evaluation of programs, and pronouncing on policies. And my view was that we are spending too much time on the program content and not enough time on policy. And throughout the period, I felt that the real job of the Planning Commission should be to push for new policy initiatives.
So is the new format of the Niti Aayog, is that something that you like?
I don't have good knowledge of what they do. But what I believe is that they have no role in the financing decision. I think that's unfortunate because, you know, part of the usefulness of the 5-year planning process, I mean, look, big corporations have budget processes that are multi-year. So a big corporation has its own planning. Where is it going to put its money? Where is it going to spend its resources? What are the new areas, etc. We had that role. Now, whether we performed it well or not is a separate issue. I think that's an important role. It's currently not being performed by the Niti Aayog. You could argue that it's being performed by the Finance Ministry. But I think I don't think that's a good idea because, you know, the Finance Ministry has a core job, which is to keep the fiscal deficit under control.
I want to get back to this very much the fact that there was a period of sustained high growth that India experienced. But a counter argument is given all the time that this was also a period where we did not see much reform, much structural reform in terms of laying the groundwork for the next round of growth impetus. And now there is a lot of scholarship which is now saying that by 2011, 2012, the steam had run out, the economy had lost its momentum, and what we are seeing now is a result of that. I mean, many of the issues that the economy is struggling with currently is essentially because of not having done enough groundwork during the good days when the growth was high.
Well, I don't actually agree with that. Look, we're a very competitive political environment. Okay, so I expect political parties to put across the facts in whatever manner suits them. But let's look at this objectively. What what accounted for the high growth in the UPA period? Okay, there's no doubt in my mind, by the way, that the tremendous reforms, gradualist but tremendous, that were initiated in 1991, and more importantly, were carried through by the United Front government, Deve Gowda, and then in the Gujarat, and even more important, carried through by the Vajpayee government. That produced a somewhat long stretch of a very solid perception of where India is going, which relied on continuity. I have a nice story, because I think it's a nice story, that when Vajpayee became Prime Minister, a whole bunch of American investors came to call on him. And I was a bit surprised that, I was told that you better be in the Prime Minister's meeting. And normally, the Finance Secretary is not called into a Prime Minister's meeting. And that decision could only have been taken either by the Prime Minister himself or Brajesh Mishra. And it was very clear. The first thing that the investors wanted to know was, is the open policy of liberalization going to continue? And Prime Minister Vajpayee said, of course. He said, look, we're a democracy. And governments change and we fight our battles. But that doesn't mean that policies change. And he then pointed to me and said, that's Montek Ahluwalia. He represents continuity. I represent change. And the American investors kind of felt this is really the way a democracy should be won. So the emphasis on continuity and basically trying to build on it. Now, Vajpayee, I would say, didn't just repeat what was being done. I would say there were two very important signals that the Vajpayee government, three actually. One, openness to FDI. Now, everybody knew that the BJP was going to be pro-private sector. I mean, it's ideologically, it used to be, party of the private sector, albeit small and middle. People were not sure whether they would be pro-FDI. And there were wings within the BJP that didn't think much of FDI. And Vajpayee gave a very strong signal that, we want more FDI, come along in, etc. So that was a signal of continuity, but a bold signal because it countered expectations. Second, it was a signal of going beyond what had been done, and that was on privatization. The Congress government, because of the old Congress legacy, etc., didn't want to go beyond disinvestment. Although many of us felt that we needed to do that. I'd been arguing that with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in the mid-1980s. When the United Front came, they were the first people that recognized that 51% is not a kind of mool mantra. We can rethink that. So they appointed a commission. They asked, Rangarajan was appointed, and then the Disinvestment Commission under Ramakrishna was appointed. They were asked to make suggestions on how do you go below 51%, but they didn't do it. So it was just kind of throwing ideas around, but not doing it. Vajpayee was the first government that actually said, we're going to privatize, and Yashwant Sinha in Parliament said that in the generality of cases, we don't need more than 26%, okay, which was a big statement. Arun Shourie led the charge very effectively, in my view, sold off some enterprises, and if you look back, what has happened to those enterprises, Balco particularly, demonstrates that they performed much better than they did earlier. But he also ran into problems because of the sale of Centaur and process-related issues, and that whole thing therefore died out. Fizzled out in a way. Unfortunate, but so I think in that period there was continuity. Now comes the UPA. I think they maintained quite a bit of their own initiatives, which to my mind helped the growth, number one. Look, when the UPA came in with the left supporting them from outside, there was a lot of fear that this is going to be a left-wing, welfare-oriented government, waste money on Magnarega and don't care about growth. Actually, they made it very plain that they did want growth. They want 7 to 8% growth, which is higher than what the BJP had achieved. So that was one point. Second, Manmohan Singh's presence as finance minister was the best signal you could send to the private sector that, look here, don't think we're going to be a bunch of loonies who are not going to stimulate private investment. We will stimulate private investment. They made tremendous use of the high growth. Some of that high growth, by the way, was because world growth was also buoyant. But I think the expansion in India's growth rate was much more than global buoyancy. Because, you know, in the first 3 years, I mean, the average growth rate was 9% during the first 4 years. And I think during that period, revenues did well, and the government had the good sense to control expenditure. So the fiscal deficit actually fell quite a bit. So we created the room for the private sector to expand, and we had a tremendous expansion in private investment.
But another counter view again is that while the growth was high, in terms of exact reforms, next level of reforms, maybe changes in labor laws or land acquisition, the country actually went back. A lot of people argue that there was too much of stress on welfare, and while you created a space for fiscal space, you, I mean, that government at least also gave it up around 2008.
No, that's completely wrong. The notion that we created space and then gave it up to welfareism is just not true, because otherwise the fiscal deficit wouldn't have fallen. I don't believe, by the way, that the Mudragam thing was as negative as you think or people think. Because, you know, frankly, Mudragam is a mechanism for building assets in rural areas. There were some debates about whether the procedures were good enough, flexible enough. In practice, we made it very flexible in the Planning Commission. I mean, one of the big things that I and Mihir Shah, my colleague, were pushing for was that we should use Mudragam with the priority that you should use it for water conserving programs. And, you know, NGOs were very opposed to that, because NGOs felt that the projects should be determined by the panchayat. And we felt that, look, that's not really the way to go, and this is much, it's a way struck a balance. Now, to the point that Isha raised, there were, I would say, 2 or 3 very major steps taken which were reform oriented. One was, of course, expanding the scope for FDI, both in airlines and in telecom, which was done instantly because it didn't require legislation. But then there was FDI in insurance, which required legislation, and the BJP solidly opposed it. I mean, I'm glad that when they came back to power, they gave up that opposition and promptly did it. But it's not true that the government of the day wasn't pushing it. It put it on its agenda, it said it must be done, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, in a way, the groundwork, it was just held back, possibly because the BJP wanted to do it themselves at some time in the future. But it's not true that they didn't try. They did try. Second, GST. You know, the GST is another example of continuity. The idea of the GST emerged from a committee headed by Vijay Kelkar, which was set up more or less as an afterthought by Jaswant Singh in the last year of the NDA government. So why don't you tell us, we passed the FRBM, how the hell do we actually achieve it? So you go and think of something. Well, these guys worked on it, and of course the government had changed, and the Kelkar report that we must bring in the GST as something that will really expand revenues was submitted to Chidambaram in 2000, towards the end of 2004. In 2005, Chidambaram announced in Parliament that the UPA government, accepts the idea that we must have a GST and we'll work towards a constitutional amendment, because the GST could not be done without a constitutional amendment. They worked on the constitutional amendment, tried very hard, but again it was blocked again by the BJP, mainly by the states of Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh.
There were a lot of rights-based approach changes that were brought
Yes.
So there were things that were pushed and they were implemented in those things. I mean, across the board, from right to education to food security, a lot of stuff was done, a lot of loan waivers were given, but on the larger structural points, even say the corporate tax cut, which has happened now, why wasn't, when there was fiscal space or when the investments were down, either way, between 2004 and 2008 when the going was good, or between 2010 and 14 when the going was bad, why weren't some of those things tried out or pushed? That's a query that a lot of people have, that it was that the period when we should have done it, and perhaps we would not be in the.
Okay, let me, two separate answers, and I'll try to be very brief, which I've failed to be so far. On the rights-based approach, I mean, I don't personally object to an element of what is nowadays called welfareism being made sort of rights-based. I mean, the right to education, can one object to it? I think the real problem is that we never recognized that what is the institutional flexibility needed to deliver the right to education. And I think that's a fair criticism, but that's very difficult. I mean, we're not doing it now either. The only area, in my view, where the government, I think, should have acted and didn't is labor. And that is essentially the same reason why the central government isn't doing it now. I mean, there's historically been in every major party a very large representation of organized labor. And the opposition of organized labor to labor reform was enormous.
One thing, this is a question that is, it's partly what Udit is talking about. But this question was asked, and I think Chidambaram did quite a bit of a fudge at your book launch, where this issue was about the twin balance sheet was brought up. Mm-hmm. Now, nobody's saying that everybody's supposed to get it right all the time. But the fact is that there was a lot of lending during the UPA period, because as you said that you were boosting infrastructure and things like that, and the idea was to get investment going in. But we saw a lot of investment being made and bank loans being made in the infrastructure sector. We also saw, you talk about the reforms that you've done, whether in airports and things like that. But we saw power. Now in power, frankly, you made no reforms. In fact, you had two parts to your power reform thing, and the part about actually doing the reform, you didn't do giving the more money to the SEBs, you did it. If you look at roads, there was no dispute resolution mechanism. One of the problems that we are finding in infrastructure is really the fact that projects are stuck. So, and there's been a lot of talk about how the BJP, and I think part of it is right, is not doing enough, etc., etc. That's fair enough. The point I want to ask you is that now, having seen the twin balance sheet crisis that we have today, if you were to do it again, would you be still pushing the same kind of bank lending and infrastructure stuff without doing the reform, which is part of the problem today? That's one question. I want to ask you a question about the role of bureaucrats, but that's later on.
Well, let me say that, when you're pushing growth, we were not actually pushing bank lending. I mean, when growth occurs, there's enthusiasm, people are borrowing, banks lend, and
you open up the infrastructure sector without doing the reform to fix payments.
But let's be clear, if you start trying to do everything, nothing will happen. So the logic of change is that you go ahead and push and watch out what the problem is and try and correct it. In my book, I mention an exchange with Gajendra Haldia on the whole issue of bank lending. So these problems had begun to surface. I think that had we in 2014, when Raghuram Rajan was the governor, I mean, he recognized that there's a problem, and he's the first one to actually surface the problem. He was much criticized for unnecessarily creating difficulties. Now, frankly, if in 2014, 2015, this issue emerged, the economic survey at the time said that, look, what we have to do is recognize the problem. That was done. We have to recapitalize the banks. That was done very partially, not enough compared to what was needed. And you have to reform the banks so that they don't behave in the same way.
So let me ask you this.
On the last, nothing has happened.
Since liberalization, we've seen all hues of government, but there seems to be a continuity about what is the broad economic strategy. There are things that governments have not been able to do, and there are certain things that governments, even when they had opposed them, say on Narega or Aadhaar, they've carried on with doing that. So are there any two ideologies really, or India only has one ideology and that is the one no matter who comes to power, will essentially.
You know, I mean, I'm glad you raised this issue because I think the strength of India as a democratic country trying very hard to get out of being a lower middle income to an upper middle income country, the strength of India depends upon a perception that there is a common consensus on what is good policy. If the picture is portrayed as one of intense competition between two conflicting ideologies, you can assume that we will just be stuck. And right up to the Vajpayee government and beyond that the UPA government, that is certainly the image. Now, some people may criticize the present government for having continued the UPA programs but renaming them. I mean, you know, the Ayushman Bharat is the old RSBY. I mean, some of the renaming is much catchier. I mean, I like the Jam Trinity. I mean, the earlier stuff, you know, financial inclusion, telecom connectivity, didn't catch the imagination, but I think Arvind Subramaniam inventing the Jam Trinity sort of seemed much catchier. So continuity, the same kind of thing, but basically hopefully doing it better, making it catchier, that's fine. I don't think, on the other hand, that I can be sure that continuity exists because, and here I point to one very specific aspect, and that is the increase in customs duties that has occurred in the last 2 or 3 years. You know, the odd increase in customs duties can be explained as a single event. But the government now seems to be driven by a different approach. Now, one possible reason is that, you know, globally, too many countries are retreating into a kind of their country first, which is sort of an economic nationalism, combined with sort of protective walls, which is really the United States. You know, the other European countries are not raising duties. President Trump is convinced that the way to beat up the rest of the world is to raise duties, and he's been doing that. But it's possible that this has created an intellectual feeling that, you know, all this old stuff about lowering duties is old-fashioned, and the new economics, although I don't think this is what is being taught in Harvard and Princeton and Berkeley, the new economics is that we should have higher protective duties. That's what we seem to be doing. I think it's an unmitigated mistake. What is interesting is that, you know, we are combining that with a slogan which I like, which is that India must take its share of global value chains. So there's an internal inconsistency. I mean, it is true in my view that one of the reasons we never generated as much employment as we could have is we didn't get into the space that was created by the liberal world economy for Western industrialized countries to purchase labor-intensive manufactured goods, which China benefited from, before that Korea benefited from, all of East Asia benefited from, Vietnam and Bangladesh benefited from. We did not do as much of that as we should have. But you know, raising duties will make it almost certain that India will not be seen as being fit, as being competitive to integrate into global value chain. Now, it wouldn't matter if the government's view was, what are global value chains? We're not interested in them. That's not the government's view. The government says we must get into global value chain. Now, you read the economic survey, very good document, by the way. I mean, the economic survey says, in order to integrate into global value chains, we must lower the duties on all the kind of imported inputs and components and all that we need. That's not what we're doing. More generally, I mean, you know, if Indian industry, given our wage levels, cannot compete in the area of toys with less than 100% duty, the idea that we will capture the market for toys in the world the way the Chinese did is complete pipe dream. So what's the rationale behind asserting these objectives and taking these actions? That's what we need a debate on. And it's not as if the government's own technical people are saying something different. You mentioned the Niti Aayog. I think one of the very sensible things that the Niti Aayog produced was a sort of 3-year agenda under Arvind Panagriya, their first vice chairman, which said that, look, it endorsed the idea that Indian customs duties must be brought down. And he said, you know, we should level them off at 7%. which meant that anything above 7% must come down, also meant that things below 7% should go up. I would find that quite a rational approach. That's clearly not the approach that the government is following. So I think to assert that everything is continuing is not true. There are dangerous reversals taking place which can have a very damaging effect. In fact, the finance minister has said that she's inviting all the industries to do a crowdsourcing of ideas on what duties should be raised. Now, you can imagine what's going to happen. Look, in any country, manufacturers have only one objective: raise the duty on my outputs, lower the duty on my inputs. She's not asking anybody what duties to lower. She's only inviting suggestions for duties to be raised. This will be a competitive increase in duties, which will just, it's going back to the 1970s, basically. People should be clear whether that's what they want, whether it would be good for Indian industry. And Indian industry should speak up. Because what I'm saying is that it's going to be very bad for Indian industry. A few industrialists have said so, but not nearly as many as one would like. And I think, by the way, the decision not to join RCEP was again very unfortunate. Because I liked the idea when the government said we must go beyond look east and we must act east. But refusing to join RCEP is not acting east. It's in fact sort of sitting on the shore and saying, no, thank you very much.
You also mentioned about the passing sentence that you mentioned that because it was Congress, the bank privatization may not have happened. So, I mean, there is a prescription for what the economy should be doing, but a big part of it is to actually do it. And where does Congress as a outfit really, since you work so closely in that framework, does it have the wherewithal?
Well, look, if you go back to the 1991 reforms, which was a coalition government but led by the Congress, Narasimha Rao providing the political leadership, Manmohan Singh doing the economic architecture, I think they undid an enormous amount of what used to be called traditional Congress policy. So quite frankly, if we could do it in 1991, I really don't see why we can't do it again. One factor that led to, made it easier to do was there was a crisis. That's point number one. Point number two is the crisis was caused by someone else. And you must remember, it is very easy to take tough steps in the face of a crisis if you can say the crisis was caused by somebody else. More difficult to take tough steps in the face of a crisis caused by you yourself, because then you have to admit, why did this happen? So that's a difficulty. But I think history suggests that parties, in this particular case the Congress party, was persuaded, much against the will of many of the individuals. Not everybody in the Congress party top leadership was willing to go along with the changes that were made, but they were made. So I think we have to recognize that the soft option is not an option for which we should thank our political leaders, because anyone can do that. If there are things that need to be done, they should be done.
You mentioned several times that increasing customs duty is an unmitigated mistake, and India's decision to walk out of RCEP is also unfortunate. Now, with India having reinitiated or initiated a review of its existing FTAs and also wanting to close up its discussions for a free trade agreement with the EU, as well as a trade deal with the US, what sort of bearing do you see these issues having on our ongoing talks, and what issues do you foresee?
A lot of this desire to scrap FTAs, etc., is based on many lobbies arguing that our FTAs have not benefited us. Now, it's interesting that the latest economic survey does a clean analysis of FTAs and says that's not true. So the first thing that one has to ask is the economic survey right or is it wrong? Because this argument keeps being made, sometimes by government officials, sometimes by other people. I happen to believe that the FTA, the economic survey, is right. The FTAs we have entered into have not done any damage. And you have to remember one thing, that when you enter into an FTA, by definition, there's an element of trade switching. So if your underlying trade is one where you're maintaining a deficit, the deficit with these guys will also increase, but probably at the expense of deficits with others. I'm afraid this is something that President Trump himself doesn't seem to understand, so I'm not surprised that our guys do. But on FTAs, I think whoever wants to argue this, I think the rest of us have a right to say, please let us know if the economic survey is right or wrong. Because if the economic survey is right, this whole argument is false.
We haven't achieved 8% in like 5 years. The RBI is now reviewing its inflation targeting paper. On the other hand, we had assumed 10% household savings, 2% current account deficit, and that was going to finance government spending and private sector. All these 5 variables are now under pressure. So it's time to review the macroeconomic framework that has governed India's policies for the last 2 decades.
Well, you're referring to the last 5 or 6 years. No, it's very clear to me that if you conduct the exercise that are we on target in macroeconomic terms, the short answer is we're not. I mean, the growth target, we've always had growth targets before. Plan target, the 11th plan targeted 9%. The 12th plan, which was after the global crisis, recognized that, look, the world has changed, so it targeted 8%. Today, we no longer have growth targets, but we have the target that we aim to become a $5 trillion economy by 24-25, starting in 2019-20, which requires a growth rate of almost 9%, okay? So the first question to ask is, are we on track? Well, the answer is clearly not. I mean, we are going to end the year somewhere well below 5% this year, 2019-20, and probably next year maybe a little above 5%. So if for the first 2 years we average only 5%, you're not going to get a 9% average for the out of the remaining 4 years unless the growth rate is well above 10% or so, which is not going to be. So that's one problem. Two, on agriculture, we have targeted doubling farm incomes over a 5-year period between, I think, 2015-16 and 2021-22. There's no chance of achieving that either because, agricultural growth is only about 6%. Maybe you add about 4 or 5% of inflation, and that will not give you a doubling. It could happen. I don't think agricultural growth can increase that much. But you could double farm incomes if you were successful in creating non-farm employment by pulling a hell of a lot of people out of farms into non-agriculture, and that we know is not happening because the growth isn't happening. So we are definitely not on target on those fronts, which would mean that macroeconomically somebody should redo the sums. Now, how do you get back on target? That's a bigger exercise. We've been talking about some of the things. People may differ. I mean, some people would say that we get back on target by raising imports duties because that's the way of increasing growth. Well, you can debate that. Will it or will it not?
The present government blames many of the issues in the banking sector, the bloated NPAs and the challenges with the state-owned banks to the credit expansion, massive credit expansion during the UPA period and various names, phone banking, legacy issues they call it. How fair is it and what is your counter to that? And my second question is that the economy is passing through a very low growth phase and the financial sector is especially in stress. What would be your advice to the finance minister to overcome, to come out of this phase?
Yeah, just to append to that, what's the M document for
today?
current?
It should be accepted that in a period of rapid growth, I mean, all boom periods are accompanied by excess bank lending. I mean, this is a fundamental law of capitalism because when growth occurs, private capitalists kind of become excessively optimistic. And frankly, if banks were sort of insisting on high enough equity coverage, there's no harm in them actually supporting this lending. But of course, they were not adequately watchful on the equity issue. I have a little description in the book which you can read on how these things go wrong. And so at the end of a boom, when the boom collapses, all booms collapse. When the boom collapses, you have a downturn. When you have a downturn, the economy slows down. If the economy slows down, a hell of a lot of projects that thought they would be able to service the debt are not able to service the debt. So the banking system gets stressed. But you know, how long should that stress last? I mean, 6 years? Had we been in a situation where somebody had said that, look, in 2014 there's a problem, this was due to excess lending, we're now fixing the problem, it's going to take a couple of years, which means that by 2017 things were beginning to move again, I think that would be a reasonable outcome. What has happened is that while the problem was clearly identified, the corrective steps needed were actually not taken. And I would say that when it comes to reform of the banking system, they're still not taken. So I've mentioned what I think needs to be done, if there's any appetite for it.
To be fair, they were not taken even in the previous...
No, absolutely. Look, let me put it this way. Reform is not something that you do instantly. If you go back to 1991, we did a hell of a lot of reform in the financial system, basically making the Indian banking system accept the new Basel norms. I mean, it didn't even have Basel norms. So, you know, the banking system in 1991 was absurd. That took 4 or 5 years or so. The next step was to open up the capital market, the domestic capital market, open up the capital account in a cautious manner, because opening up the capital account helped the domestic capital market, and opening up insurance. Now, we've discussed that was politically not very easy, but it kind of got done. Private insurance companies came in. They're now talking about selling some equity in LIC, which is a good idea, although selling a small portion of equity doesn't add up to a big management change. So it's not true that nothing happened.
I just wanted to take a broader picture about how the Indian economy is in considerable stress right now, but there doesn't seem to be any electoral impact of that. I mean, in terms of how do you see the rise of populism on the one hand, and democratic recession, and the economic stress that is there, and how is that debate playing out? Is Indian economy, I mean the electoral narrative now economy proof that there can be considerable stress and not have any repercussions?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I'm not a political scientist. So what you're really saying is you're making the assertion, with which I agree, that the economy is under considerable stress. Even if you don't bother very much about GDP, that stress is most felt in the lack of creation of job opportunities. Young people who are graduating from university, college, school, etc., are looking for much better jobs than their parents had. And unless the economy performs differently, very soon they will all get very frustrated. Now, maybe in the meantime they can be distracted by other things, but in a few years' time, I mean, populism in the sense of saying that, look, you're not getting a job, but I'm giving you this benefit, this is totally unsustainable because you can't afford it. And so it will reflect itself either in the government borrowing excessively, directly or indirectly, which will only squeeze out the private sector, which will make the jobs crisis worse. Now, how this will play out, that requires one to understand how the politics of the country plays out. Will it be the same all over the country? Will it be different in different states? I am not competent to judge. But the notion that you can ignore the economic side and simply rely on populism, I just don't think is viable.
Did the reaction to demonetization, for example, surprise you?
When you say the reaction, you mean the public reaction?
Public reaction.
Yeah, I think it was politically extremely well sold. And it surprised me in the sense that given the disruption that it, I think, caused, I'm surprised that there was, the political messaging was not one which led people to think that anyone resented it. I mean, people minded the loss of jobs, etc., clearly, But somehow the political management of the demonetization has to be called a success.
You were a political appointee. And,
Yes.
And you are seen, I mean, you had also the benefit of watching the politics being played inside the room, but from the outside, kind of. How, the two questions I have, first of all, is very small. You have worked with Chidambaram and Pranab Mukherjee. What has, as finance ministers, in resource allocation, that way, I mean, planning commission and then these two people who had control over the purse strings. What is your experience in given their rivalry within the government? And second, where did UPA2 lose the political ball? I mean, when you step back, look back with the benefit of hindsight, where did you lose? And because 60 seats Dr. Singh got for UPA, I don't think Indira after in 71, she added 55 seats to the previous tally. He added 60 seats to Congress's tally.
In 2009.
Nine, yeah. Where did UP lose the plot?
You know, I feel that the two things that in the UPA 2 they didn't do. One is they did not adequately explain to people that for the UPA as a whole, there were very substantial achievements, okay? And a lot of the achievements, particularly the reduction in percentages and absolute numbers in poverty, were achievements as of 2011-12. So it wasn't just in UPA 1. I've gone into this in great detail, and I have no real answer why they were not able to project these achievements. And I think it's unfortunate. I don't know whether there is some soul searching, but if you're going to an election, then it's important to indicate, have you got any achievements or not? And I don't think that the Congress did that adequately. No, Prime Minister did that. Even Mrs. Gandhi in some of her speeches did that, but somehow it was not part of the dominant political discourse. Now, I wasn't involved in any of those strategy discussions, so I can't say why they didn't do it, but it was a mistake. You know, one of the biggest achievements of the UPA, which has a human aspect to it, is in the area of health. Because, you know, polio got eliminated. The Director General of WHO came to India, I think it was 2014, February, and just before the election, and made the announcement that India is now polio-free, okay? They only make that declaration if for 3 years there have been no reported cases of polio, which really meant that, you know, India had eliminated polio with effect from 2011. In my mind, you know, particularly since the Congress was so concerned about education and health and the NGOs and all, I mean, this should have been trumpeted from the rooftops as a major, major achievement. It's there in the little documents that come out from the PMO and the Planning Commission, but it never formed part of the political discourse. So that's a major failing, which I can't explain why it didn't happen. The second area where I think they lost out was the, you know, tremendous public perception that corruption had reached impossible levels. And there were many factors underneath that. The Anna Hazare movement, mobilization by NGOs. And you know, corruption's a problem everywhere. It's not as if India is the only corrupt country in the world, and even the government would accept that there was corruption. But somehow the way that whole thing was managed, the UPA never got around to making its case that it is being tarred, perhaps unfairly, by a particular brush. My suspicion is that they did not actually appreciate the fact that social media, new methods of communication, whatever it is, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., have shifted the arena where these issues are discussed. And that, I mean, they paid the price for that.